So I want to welcome everyone to this first meeting of 2026 for the travel group. And before we proceed with the meeting, I just wish to acknowledge that I live in the unceded ancestral and traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Um, Today's speaker is going to be Rick Stokes, and I would like to have everybody except Rick mute their microphones so we don't get any extraneous noise. So please do that now if you would. Um, and I'm going to allow Rick to share his screen now. And Rick, you can introduce yourself also. The big
So have you
unite,
got
the big hair. And
have you
I'm
got
going
my
to just hold on a minute. I've got you share screen
you got the
sharing
titles?
now. Yeah.
So you've got the title there?
Yes, it's all perfectly showing now, Rick, and I've put
Okay,
you
great.
as speaker.
All right. So I'll start off by apologizing to any French speakers out there because I do not speak a word of French, and so most of my pronunciations are probably going to be quite horrible. So Moya and I, in June of last year, 25, took a trip to France, and it was to visit with my sister, who lives or has a place in the Jura region in East France, bordering to Switzerland, where her main residence is. Neither of us had actually visited France before, which was perhaps a little strange, but anyway, we took the opportunity whilst we were going to be there to visit Paris and some of the famous attractions in that area. After Paris, we travelled by train to town Bourg-en-Bresse in eastern France, and from there, my sister picked us up and took us to the hamlet of Grand Fontaine, where she has a converted warehouse. So basically, we had some time in Paris, then trained to Bourg-en-Bresse, and where we stayed then in the Jura region, visiting a number of different places. So we started off in Paris, and we had 10 days there basically in early June. And the weather was very friendly towards us. We only had one day with a little bit of rain, but it was quite hot. So we got quite tired walking around Paris, but it was still nice. The locals were very friendly, and unlike warnings we'd had, everybody was happy to speak English to us, and which was very useful because, as I say, I don't speak French. So we stayed in a hotel, Champ de Mars, and this was chosen because it was quite central to a lot of things. And one of the things was it was right next to the Rue Claire, which is a great area for restaurants and shops. It's got a pedestrian walkway. And so we were able to find plenty of different places to eat in for breakfast and evening meals. So it was a very good area to stay in. We used Rick Steves' pocket guide to Paris and found it very useful for the whole stay in Paris. We started off our first day. We took his historic Paris walk, which is shown on the right there. It covers mainly the Ile de la Cité, but some of the left bank as well, taking in a lot of the major sites of Paris. So we started off by using the wonderful metro there and ended up in the Cité station, and its entrance is one of the few Art Nouveau entrances that are left in Paris now. They were designed by Hector Guimard. There were a few left, but not many. So from there, we walked to Notre Dame, the Gothic cathedral. And here you can see the western facade. It was constructed starting in 1163 and finished by 1260. So it took quite a while. Over the years, many things happened there, but one of them was the coronation of Napoleon in 1804. It's visited by millions of people annually. One of the major sites in Paris that people go to. And of course, as everybody knows, there was a fire in 2019 that destroyed a lot of the roof and the spire, the flesh. Restoration is still ongoing, but we were lucky in that it opened in December 2024. So by the time we were there in June 25, you could go in to the cathedral. At the entrance is the central portal, and this shows the last judgment here of people rising from the graves and being sent to heaven or hell. And one of the nice little touches is that the devil is trying to tip the balance on the scales which weigh the souls to see where they're headed to. At another door, the portal of Mary, is Saint Denis. This is him there. He was beheaded by Roman priests and apparently got up, picked up his head and went off to meet his maker. Inside, as you can see, Notre Dame has been beautifully restored. You see the vaulted arches. And here's the new font, the baptismal font that has been built. And in the foreground, you can see the altar at the front of the church. Opposite the altar is the famous rose window in the south transept. Quite a beautiful window. And some close up there, you can see the 12 apostles in the center of the rose window. Below it are the 16 prophets. Walking up the ambulatory, you didn't go up the centre because that service was being held at the time, but you could go up the side ambulatory and walk around the interior. So you get a nice view of some of the other windows and the hanging chandeliers. And then in one little apse, there's the old font, which was designed in 85 by an architect called Gougy. At the front is the altar. It's the high altar with a number of statues around it, including the main one, a common theme of the statue of a Virgin of Pity, or often called a Pieta. This one was a white marble sculpted in 1723 by Nicolas Cousteau. And on the right, you can see the stained glass windows that are above the high altar. Here's 3 examples of other stained glass windows around the cathedral. Quite beautiful. Outside, though, we wandered around the exterior of Notre Dame, and you can see that there's still plenty of restoration that is ongoing. Cranes and scaffolding everywhere. You're doing a lot of work on the gargoyles whilst we were there. And you could see that the spire has been replaced, and the architect Philippe Villeneuve had designed a new rooster to go on the very top of the spire, as you can see here. So after Notre Dame, we took a walk over the Pont de l'Arche, and on there we saw some street musicians playing jazz, popular in Paris, of course, and also this gentleman here with his bulldog, or whatever kind of dog that is, who had obviously succumbed to the heat. He'd had enough, so he was slumped out. From there, we got onto the left bank and visited the what is called the Greek Quarter, where there's a church, St. Severin's. And again, vaulted arches, lovely, but not quite as ornate as Notre Dame, of course. But still some very nice stained glass. And there we see St. Gonzaga receiving a communion from St. Borromeo. And then on the right, you can see St. George and the Dragon. The next thing on the tour was Sainte-Chapelle. This was built in 1242, between 1242 and 48 by King Louis IX, and it was built mainly as a symbol of his divine right, as the kings loved to believe in those days. And it also was built to house the relics of the Passion of Christ, which he had purchased. There's two chapels, a lower chapel, which is for the palace staff, and then this upper chapel you can see on the left, which was for the royal family and dignitaries. So the lower chapel is dedicated to Virgin Mary, much lower ceiling, smaller windows. It's the upper chapel that has the magnificent stained glass windows that are so famous. There are 15 windows that are 50 feet tall, and they depict over 1,100 Bible scenes, telling the story of the Old and New Testaments. Back in 1239, King Louis IX, he purchased 22 holy relics of the Passion of Christ, and he bought them from the Emperor of Constantinople, who was a bit short of cash at the time. And these were kept in Sainte-Chapelle until later years, when the most famous of the relics, the Crown of Thorns, it was moved to the Notre Dame. And it fortunately was not damaged in the fire. So here we see the lower chapel. The decoration dates from the 19th century and was an attempt to recreate the medieval decorations. There's a copy of a stone statue of Louis IX here that is kept in the apse. But it's the upper chapel that most people take the photographs of. And here we see some of these 50-foot windows, absolutely amazing. And the ceiling, of course, with stars painted on the ceiling and chandeliers hanging down. At the front is the reliquary altar, which is raised up on high. And this was to display the crown of thorns, the most famous of the relics. So access to this altar was limited to the priest and the king, and was accessed via some stairs at the back. Now, the arch supporting the altar is adorned with two angels that are holding a copy of the crown of thorns, which was actually stored in the reliquary altar. At the other end of the chapel is the rose window of the west, and this was entirely redone in 15th century in what is called the flamboyant Gothic style. Quite a spectacular window, as you can see there. Around about are the 12 apostles, statues of the 12 apostles, and here's an example of two of them. An example of three of the 50-foot windows, and you can see here that there's many panels telling different parts of the Old and New Testament. Whilst we were there, they were doing some restorations in the upper chapel, and I thought rather nicely they walled off the restoration area so we couldn't see the workers, but they used mirrors to do so, which allowed for some interesting photographs where you could get reflections of the rose window at the same time as a shot of the high altar. So adjoining Sainte-Chapelle is the conciergerie. It's part of the same area, but we didn't visit it. We just walked around the outside, and it was used during the revolution to hold prisoners that were awaiting the guillotine. We then carried on to the Place Dauphine, and from there we could see the west front of the Palais de Justice. And we could also spend some time watching the locals playing boule. And it was quite something, a bit like Crown Green bowling that we have here, but somewhat different. And what I found interesting was they didn't toss the ball underhand. They sort of flicked it. As you can see, this gentleman here, he's just flicked his ball. And they were so accurate. It was quite amazing to watch them. So the next day, we had a trip to the Orsay Museum, which is housed in a former railway station. And I think everybody will know it houses a very large collection of Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, some of my favourite artists. So I really wanted to go there. It's quite obvious that it used to be a station when you look at the interior. And they've got this lovely clock remaining from the days when it was a station. And in the central alleyway, there's lots of statues, and there were 3 examples. But it was the art that was in the side rooms that I was mainly interested in, and there's a few of my favourites here. A Vincent van Gogh, a Monet, and then my 2 favourite Impressionists, Pissarro and Sisley. I had a lot of examples of their work. But I also found a couple of artists new to me. I'd never heard of Cross, and he's a Post-Impressionist. And Achille Lauger, something like that, was another one I'd never seen before. So after we'd been to the Orsay, we took a trip up to the Arc de Triomphe. And as most of you know, it was commissioned in 1806 after the victory of Austerlitz by Napoleon. But it didn't get completed until many years later in the reign of Louis Philippe I, 1836. Quite a dramatic arch with lots of sculptures included in it. And we went to the top, of course. But here's some of the close-up of some of the carvings that adorn the arc. From the top, you get a fairly decent view of the Eiffel Tower, and of course the view down the Champs-Élysées to the Louvre that I'm sure many people have seen. The next day, we took a trip to the palace at Versailles, and as I can see, there were just a few tourists. I found really quite unpleasant. There were so many people there going around the actual palace. It kind of spoiled the whole experience. But anyway, the palace was started as a hunting lodge by Louis XIII in 1623. Louis XIV expanded the lodge into a proper palace, and it went through several iterations of expansion from 61 to 1715. Probably the most well-known residents, Louis XV and XVI, renovated the interiors and turned it into what it is now. 1789, though, the French Revolution, of course, swept the royal family and government from Versailles. And inside, there's all the famous sights to be seen. Here are a couple of them: the Royal Chapel and the Hall of Mirrors. And depending on your point of view, it's either an example of French Baroque splendour or ostentatious tack, and you might guess which one I think. The gardens outside were a much more pleasant experience because you could get away from the crowds quite easily. It's an absolutely massive area, covers 800 hectares, and it's landscaped predominantly in the classic French formal garden style, and there's numbers of fountains. The first one you come across is Apollo's fountain as you're accessing the gardens, which I found most interesting because of this: a nice great cormorant who was sitting on one of the dolphins. And we wandered around the gardens for quite some time. It was a pleasant experience, and came across a number of fountains. A couple of examples here: the Enceladus fountain. Enceladus was one of the giants that fought with the Greek gods, and of course came off second best. He was buried under Mount Etna, as can be seen there. And then on the right is the Flora fountain, and Flora was one of the Roman, she was the Roman goddess of flowers and of spring. The next day we had a visit to the Musée de Lingerie, which is the permanent home of the famous very large scale murals done by Monet of his water lily garden. There are other Impressionist and post-Impressionist works there, though, of course, not just these 8 murals, but they're the main attraction. The orangery had been built originally by Napoleon to store the citrus trees that he had in the Tuileries garden. In winter, it got too cold for them, so they were stored indoors. But it presented a perfect place to house these very large murals. A couple of examples of them here that you can see. Quite spectacular. Outside is the Place de la Concorde, Harmony Square is called. And it's the largest public square in Paris, 7.6 hectares, quite a large place. Originally, it was called the Place Louis the 15th. It's changed its name a few times. During the French Revolution, it was called the Place de la Révolution. And it was the site where a number of people were executed, including Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and Robespierre. Quite the amazing site, and it's where the Luxor obelisk is mounted. This was gifted by Egypt to France in the 1830s. On the base of the obelisk is an illustration that shows how they actually erected it at the time of its transport to France. Also there in the Place de Concorde are 2 very large fountains, one called the Fountain of River Commerce and one Fountain of the Seas. Both of them are quite spectacular and fairly similar. There are some small differences though. The main one at the time was that the Fountain of the Seas was actually active and the other one wasn't. So we got some close-ups there of the fountains in action. Same day we visited the Musée des Égouts, and this is the Paris Sewer Museum. A little smelly, but a very interesting place to visit. We really enjoyed our trip there. So the sewers in Paris do date back to the Middle Ages, but they were very crude, and the modern network was built under the Baron Haussmann's, the architect, and his engineer, Eugène Belgon, actually built these very extensive sewers. And on the left, you can see there was actually real live sewer rats still running around in the sewers that you could see from these tunnels that we were walking along. These large wooden balls were used for apparently cleaning out the sewage pipes. They could run these balls down them, and it would create pressure waves which would remove the sludge. This was, of course, on gravity-fed down sloping tunnels, but if they had straight tunnels, they had to put these balls into this machine here, which was dragged along, and the same thing, it created pressure waves that dislodged the sludge. So I would definitely recommend this museum if anybody was to visit Paris. Very interesting. Of course, we had to go to the Eiffel Tower, the most iconic landmark in Paris. And if you want, you can buy a replica in about 50,000 locations around Paris. There were chaps selling stuff. Gets about 5 to 7 million visitors a year. It was a wrought iron lattice tower built at the end of the Champ de Mars, and named after the engineer who built it, Gustave Eiffel. Built between 1887 and 89, and there are 3 floors which are accessible by steps or by lift. We took the lift up to the 2nd floor, but we'll come to that later. On our walks around Paris, of course, we saw the Eiffel Tower from many different points of view. Here's a couple of shots from the Champ de Mars. Here's one from the Place de Trocadero. Another from Pont Alexander. And then one from the Avenue de New York, which was on the right bank. And here's a close-up shot or two when we were about to access the tower and go up. You can see that it wasn't just a piece of utilitarian ironwork. There's some beautiful lattice work, making it quite a decorative piece of work. And we took the trip up to the second floor. We didn't go to the very top. I'm not very great with heights, and we'd heard that anyway, the views weren't that good from the top. They're much better from the second floor. So that's what we did. And from there, you get all sorts of views of the surrounding areas. Here you can see the Jardin de Trocadero, which are in front of the Palais de Chaillot. From another angle, you can see Montmartre, and you can see the Basilica of Sacré-Cœur there. Yeah. Also from this area, you can see the Palais de Chaillot. Oh, sorry, Palais de Découverte. The Pont de l'Arma. And the fairly recent addition, the Holy Trinity Cathedral and Russian Orthodox Center. From a different angle, you can see the park of Champ de Mars, which has got the École Militaire at one end, and the Tour Montparnasse further on. Many Parisians apparently think this is a terrible eyesore that spoils the cityscape. Others think it's fine because you apparently get a very good view from the top. And then on the River Seine, from the tower, you could see this replica of the Statue of Liberty, much smaller than the one in New York, but this one's on Swan Island in the middle of the Seine. And of course, we had a couple of walks along the banks of the Seine. It's a very pleasant thing to do. It's a place to stop off for a bite to eat and all sorts of different things to see. And it's a good way to access some of the sites that we've visited anyway. And this is probably the most spectacular of the bridges that you come across as you're walking along. This is Pont Alexandre III, and it's got Art Nouveau lamps. There's cherubs, nymphs, and winged horses at either end. It was built between 1896 and 1900, named after Tsar Alexander III of Russia, because they'd concluded the Franco-Russian alliance in 1892. So this was to celebrate that event. And as you can see, some close-up here, there are these are two examples of the 4 gilt bronze statues of the Fames. And in Roman mythology, the farmer were the personification of fame. In this situation, they used the Fames are restraining Pegasus in different poses, and they're watching over the bridge, but they also supply support. The masonry plinths underneath the statues give a counterbalance to the arch and so help support the bridge itself. Here's a close-up of 2 of the Fames. This is Pegasus, of course, being held by the war Fame, and this is the battle Fame. Not quite sure how you tell the difference particularly, but there you go. And in the centre, on either side of the bridge, are the on this case, the nymphs are carrying the arms of Paris. On the other side, it's the arms of Russia. Of course, there's lots of boats on the Seine. We were on one of them as we took a boat trip down the river, and you come across lots of other day trip boats like the one we were on. But you also see a number of houseboats. Quite a few people live in boats actually moored on the Seine. I think they're rather expensive, apparently. But interesting to me, I like canals and river traffic, and there were a lot of working boats using the Seine. But also we saw many people posing by the Seine. Here's a wedding photograph, and here's a presumably fashion model having their photographs taken. There's people relaxing by the Seine and couples sharing time by the Seine. Well used by Parisians and tourists, of course. The next day we had what for us was our favourite visit. We went to Père Lachaise Cemetery. This cemetery was opened in 1804, and it's named after the confessor to Louis XIV, Père Francois de Lachaise. It was bought by the city in 1804 and established as a cemetery by Napoleon. He wanted, or basically put a law into place that required that sections of the cemetery should be dedicated to specific religions. So there's a Jewish section and a Muslim section within the cemetery. These days, it's very difficult to get buried there. There's a very long waiting list, and plots rarely become available. Most of the sites are maintained by families, and they're not going to be made available anytime soon. They range from simple unadorned headstones to massive towering monuments and mini chapels dedicated to well-known people or families. Lots of famous figures are buried there. There's a few examples here. Sarah Bernhardt, Bizet, Chopin, some artists, Corot, Ong, Pissarro, Gertrude Stein, the American, was born. Oscar Wilde is buried there, and Jim Morrison. And that was the one I went to see, was Jim Morrison. Here's some examples of the different tombs and chapels that had been built to house families. As you can see, here is a family, and here's another family, Hottinger. But it's in a lovely setting. It's very rambling pathways that go meandering around the cemetery. You see all sorts of some obviously well-kept recent tombstones, and some of the older ones here. Lots of wildlife is apparently present. There are lots of feral cats, and even urban foxes are apparently there, but you're not going to see them during the day. But what we did see were a couple of examples of Eurasian jays. Very nice bird. Here's some of the more ornate tombstones with statues here of a young boy with his faithful dog. Looks like some soldier who's come off worst in a war. And then some of the famous artists, Pissarro, Ingres, and Corot, are buried there, as is Oscar Wilde, the playwright and writer, bit of a character, and Jim Morrison. For those who maybe don't know him, he was the lead singer in the rock band The Doors, who died at the age of 27, the deadly age for rock stars. And he happened to be living in Paris at the time, and he was buried there. So these two tombstones, these two areas are shielded off because there's lots of graffiti has been written on them over the years, so they have to be protected. The next day we took a trip to Giverny, the Monet's house He bought this house in 1890 and set out to create gardens that he wanted to paint, where many of his famous paintings have been done, of course, of the water garden. But here is in front of the house is the Clos Normand, and that's basically rows of flowers with trellises and climbing roses. And across the road, you access the water garden with the famous Japanese bridge and the water lily pond. So here you see the water lily pond, and here's the Japanese bridge. Here's one of the resident gardeners who's boating around the water lily pond, fixing up flowers here and there. Again, a very touristy area. Absolute busloads of people turned up every day, apparently, and because we were there in June. But still, not a bad experience. A little bit crowded, but not too bad. And there were some lovely flowers. I even managed to get a few shots of water lilies in my Monet style water lily photo. Wasn't the peak time for the water lilies, but it was still okay. We got a little bit of a view of them. But the roses were in a wonderful state, as you can see here, a trellis and a kind of rose tree. Some other shots of the Clos Normand, where you can see the trellises over one of the paths, full of roses. Excuse me. Inside, you slowly meander through the house, following the huge crowds of people. And they've done a reproduction of his studio, where he had, these are all copies, but he had originals from his friends amongst the Impressionists and some of his own. Here's a copy of one of his. And the dining room, as you can see here, lots of Japanese prints. He had a very large collection of Japanese prints, very popular at the time amongst the Impressionist artists. The kitchen you can also see. And again, more Japanese prints around, along with period furniture. So that was basically Paris. So from there, we took one of the high-speed trains from the Gare de Lyon, and that took us down to Bourg-en-Bresse. And that is in the region, that's right, of Franche-Comté. Apparently it's just been recently, 2016, has been put together with Bourgogne, so it's now Bourgogne, Franche-Comté, appalling pronunciation, sorry. And within there, you can see the department of Jura, which borders with Switzerland. And that's where we spent most of our time. We started off in Grand Fontaine, where my sister has got this converted farmhouse. There was only 3 buildings with people in them in the little hamlet there. So it's quite a different experience from Paris. Absolutely beautiful garden she has at the back, with places to sit and enjoy meals. And for me, it was especially a treat because there were all sorts of insects there. And a lot of these insects were old friends from when I lived in Britain and hadn't seen for some time. And we got here the buff-tailed bumblebee, meadow brown butterfly, a large skipper. Beautiful brimstone butterflies, male and female. A pearl bordered fritillary. Hadn't seen that for a long time. And then a couple that I hadn't seen before. This is the scarce swallowtail. It's a bit like our western tiger swallowtail that we see here in BC. It's got the name scarce swallowtail because in England it really is quite scarce. You hardly ever see it. But on the continent, it's quite a common butterfly. So that was a treat for me. But the main treat was this hummingbird hawk moth. We do get them in England, but I'd never seen them. But in my sister's garden, they were quite prevalent. There was about a dozen of them. And as you can see, they get their name because they feed on the wing, just like a hummingbird. So they got the proboscis there, which is feeding on the nectar in the flowers whilst they're hovering above the flower. Quite a wonderful little moth. And it's one of the few day flying moths. Most moths you see at night, but there's a dozen or so of them you do commonly see during the daytime, and hummingbird hawk moth is one of them. So from Grand Fontaine, we had several trips with my sister. We went to a little town called Crescia, and there we were treated to a trip around a garden workshop, or l'atelier jardin. And this is a garden that has been created and maintained by this dedicated couple. And they've been awarded a remarkable garden award, and quite deservedly so. Just a spectacular little place. Got a Japanese garden section and all different flowers. It was really beautiful. Interesting dragon carving air out of a piece of wood. Some koi fish in a pond. Again, the Japanese garden, a little garden shed with clematis and roses. And some beautiful flowers, roses, asters, clematis. And for me, again, lovely butterflies, painted lady and marbled white. Again, old friends from England. Another trip we had was to a place called Saint-Laurent-le-Roche, and this map that was present at the site illustrates how in the Jura there's these lines of mountains going basically north to south. So if you want to go west to east, it's quite an effort. You're going up and down these mountain chains. But here we went up to Saint-Laurent-le-Roche, sorry, and climbed up the hill to the lookout of the Madonna, it's called. Here's the Madonna. And it was located on the former site of the castle that was there in Saint-Laurent-le-Roche. In the village itself, you can see the church, and then some examples of coloured tiles, which we'll come to in a more spectacular fashion later on. The next day, we had a day trip to a little town in Switzerland where my niece lives. So I visited with their family. And we went from Grand Fontaine into Switzerland to Beaune, which was a municipality in the canton of Vaud, near Geneva, basically. It's a small town, about 3,500, been populated since the Bronze Age, but as a town, it was only documented from 1177, and it spreads along the river Beaune and is at the foot of the Jura Plateau, above Lake Geneva. Its main feature is the Beaune Castle, which was built around 1197. Passed from hand to hand over the centuries from various families, but ended up as property of the state of Vaud in 1798, and finally the town of Beaune since 1835. It was recently renovated in 1988 and is listed as a Swiss cultural asset of national importance. And it actually houses a secondary school where my great nephew attends there. A lovely little town. We had a nice walk around. this old town hall, which has got a granette connected to it, which is a covered marketplace, basically, with a grain storage on the top. Nice old buildings everywhere. A number of different decorative water fountains. And windows with nice shutters. I like photographing windows. Not sure I should, because there might be people inside, but anyway, that's what I do. They also had a number of these very decorative lamp holders for street lamps. So after that day trip, we had the next day we went to a place called Seine. And this was built in the middle of the 11th century, and it was built on a priory that had been founded in the 6th century by Emeritus, a hermit from St. Claude. The church is now isolated in surrounding fields, but there had been a village there that was burnt down in 1477 by Louis XI's troops. They spared the church then. The church had been restored completely in 2011, and it offers a fine example of early Romanesque. Inside, quite austere, but still attractive, and a very interesting domed roof to the altar area. Outside there was a interesting gravestone with an iron cross, and these pews inside didn't look that comfortable, but were obviously of some age. Nearby is in the area is the Le Cabane de Boeuf, and it's a cave that's very close to the community of Saint-Emeritus. And the name comes from the local patois, cabane, which means cave. And there's a stalagmite deep in the cave that apparently looks a bit like the belly of an ox. So, cabane de boeuf. We didn't go deep enough in to see this stalagmite. So the next place we visited was Baume Le Monsieur. And this is one of the most beautiful villages of France. It's been awarded this membership of the association. It lies within an extensive steep head valley in the Jura. And these steep head valleys, or sometimes called blind valleys, are deep, narrow, flat-bottomed valleys with an abrupt ending, as you can see here. And they're usually in limestone or karst landscapes. This one's a limestone. The cliffs here around Baume Le Monsieur are about 200 meters high. And the village itself is dominated by the former Beaune Abbey. This was first mentioned earlier the 9th century, when a monastery was established under Abbot Beaune. In 1759, the monks were required to prove 16 quarters of nobility, which apparently means you had to have that number of nobles in previous generations of your family before you could enter the monastic community. And this gave it its name of Baume Le Monsieur, the messieurs being these nobility. During the French Revolution, though, the abbey declined and the chapter was dissolved, the buildings were confiscated and sold off privately. But the abbey church was saved and maintained as St. Peter and became the village's parish church. In 2023, so very recently, the whole complex has been listed as a historic monument. As you can see, it's been well looked after. Inside, the main feature at the altar is this retable, which is a 16th century example. A retable is a structure or an element that's placed on or behind, but above an altar. This one is a mixed media triptych, as you can see, a central part is carved wood and then painted outer panels. Vaulted ceilings, Joan of Arc, and quite a spectacular pulpit. And some other statues around the church. Around the surrounds of the previous abbey were some rather attractive little laneways. And again, another fountain there. Next, we visit Arc-et-Senans. And this is the site of some Royal Saltworks, a complex that was commissioned during the reign of Louis XVI, designed by a famous architect, Claude Nicolas Ledoux. It was an example of Enlightenment ideals that were applied in architecture of industrial areas, hoping to match the quality that you would see in palaces and religious buildings. The place was built because in the 18th century, salt was an essential and valuable commodity. So Franche-Comté had been relatively well endowed with salt springs, and so there were a lot of small salt works around that basically just boiled water over small wood fires. But of course, this exhausted the local wood. And so they built this purpose-built factory near the Forest of Chaux, so there'd be a good supply of wood. And they actually planned to bring the brine to the factory by a canal, and that's what happened. And here we see the entrance, very spectacular, the director's house. These were the quarters for carpenters, coopers, clerks and labourers. And these were the actual buildings where the salt was processed. The original plan had included a city, but that would have formed a perfect circle, but the city never did get started. All that was finished was the semicircle of industrial buildings, and in 1775 it had been built. At its heyday, they produced about 4 million kilograms of salt, but in 1895 production ceased because the inhabitants of Arc-et-Senans were protesting about the pollution of their wells. And of course, at the same time, sea salt was being brought in by rail, which outcompeted them. But as you can see, the design was far from utilitarian. It was quite decorative. The entrance and director's house were spectacular. That's the salt works and Cooper's houses. And as you can see, it's quite decorative as well, not just utilitarian. We visited Arbois, which is a commune in the Jura department, known mainly for wine. They had some historical buildings, the Château Bontemps, the Berchet Mill, but main reason for visiting there was to see Louis Pasteur's house. It was kept in a state that basically was left when he was living there. As you can see the interior, there's all sorts of artifacts from the time that he was living there. Pasteur was a French chemist, pharmacist and famous microbiologist. And he was renowned for discoveries in vaccination, fermentation, pasteurization, which is what he's mainly known for, named after him. He also was known for his controversies and rivalries, notably with the famous German microbiologist Robert Koch. Pasteurization was because he found out that microbial organisms were the cause of beverages getting spoiled. And so he invented a process where you could heat the liquids to preserve them, heating between 60 and 100 degrees. And we still do that with milk, we pasteurize it. His advances in vaccination were mainly in chicken cholera, anthrax, and rabies. Now, Edward Jenner is the man who's mainly known for discovering vaccination to protect against smallpox, and he used naturally weakened variants of the smallpox. Pasteur developed mechanisms to artificially weaken pathogens so that you could use them as a vaccine. He's also well known because he did some experiments to disprove a popular theory at the time of spontaneous generation, which thought that living matter could arise from non-living matter, e.g., maggots could arise from dead flesh. So he heated broth in a swan neck valve, and he let the flask sit and didn't get any growth. But if he broke off the neck or tilted the neck such that the liquid could have access to the air, he demonstrated that you could get microbial growth, proving that it wasn't spontaneous generation, it was organisms coming from the air into the broth that was growing. Here's some of his lab materials.
What time do you start? I just want to make.
The next place we visited was Hospice de Beaune, sometimes called Hôtel Dieu de Beaune. It's considered to be the wine capital of Burgundy. We're now not in the Jura, we're in the Burgundy area. It was a charitable almshouse that was built in 1443 by Nicholas Rollin. And it's one of the finest examples of 15th century Burgundian architecture. Now it's a museum. It consists of two-storied buildings arranged around a stone courtyard, but it's got these beautiful ornate rooftops and dormer windows, as you can see here. 3 of the buildings around the courtyard are decorated with this glazed tile roofing, a technique that probably had its origins in Hungary, but has become a trademark of Burgundy. As you can see here, absolutely beautiful. They used 4 colours of tiles, red, brown, yellow and green, and they were interlaced to form designs. These are replica tiles from early 20th century. They first got a patient in 1452. The sick and the elderly, the destitute, were all welcomed and treated. So the room of the poor is a very large room and furnished with 2 rows of curtained beds. The central area was where a table and benches were set up for meals. The ceiling has got a painted frame, and it's like a upside down skiff. And each of the beams have got sculpted caricatures and painted as well. Lovely. The nurses and, well, basically the nuns who looked after the patients had a very busy day. Up at 5, lots of looking after patients and praying, and then bedtime at 9. And these are the small beds where the patients were lying. At one end of the ward is the chapel, and its location was chosen which allowed the bedridden to still attend mass from their beds. And it now houses a copy of the Van der Weyden polyptych altarpiece, but very famous one. And the original is now housed in the museum in a controlled atmosphere, and I was able to go into that area and get a photo of the original, which as you can see is a bit more colourful. And this is the Van der Weyden altarpiece from 15th century. So that was the end of our tour of East France, and so we come to the end.
Well, thank you very much, Rick. I'm going to ask you to stop sharing your screen now, and we'll ask for comments or questions from the audience. View gallery. So what a beautifully illustrated thought for a first session of the year. Very impressive photographs.
Beautifully organized.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent talk. Thank you very much, Rick. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Richard.
Are there any questions or comments? You'll have to just talk because I can't see everyone. There are lots of people on the screen, more than I can see.
A small scientific comment. The hummingbird moth is a beautiful example of what's called convergent evolution. In
Yep.
North America, we've got hummingbirds everywhere. In Europe,
And South America.
yes, and but in Europe, not so. And
No.
these hummingbirds, the moths, adapted to fill that niche, and they act like hummingbirds. They hum,
They certainly
they
do.
hover. They have a proboscis. They have the same shape. You could see the shape of the body is very similar too,
Yeah.
but they come from totally different routes. One's an
Absolutely.
insect, and the other one was a dinosaur.
Yeah, the body is typical of all the hawk moths. They have that rather stout bodies.
Yeah,
But the hummingbird is, well, the clear wing hawk moths also look like mimics of bees. So the hawk moth group is a great family of moths.
they sound very creative.
They're wonderful. Yeah.
I hope you tried the wine in the Jura.
Actually, no, I don't like wine, so
Oh,
it was a bit wasted on me, that area. Yeah, it's my sister obviously tries it a lot, and she says it's wonderful stuff, but I've never really liked wine.
well,
You commented, Rick, about you visited Saint Severin Church in
Yes.
Paris.
Yeah, in the Greek Quarter. Yeah.
Yeah. That's an area that I actually like to stay in Paris. There's a hotel right next door to that church.
Okay.
Wonderful small hotel, but it's so beautifully located.
Yeah.
Just walk across the bridge and you're at Notre Dame.
Yeah. And it's a lively area, I found, isn't it? It was nice.
It is. It's next to the Latin Quarter also, which I don't particularly care for, but it is a really nice location, close to the Sorbonne and so on.
Yeah. And they were saying, I just called it that. I mean, they were saying it should be called the Greek Quarter now because there's so many Greek restaurants.
Restaurant,
and you can get gyro over there and all sorts. Yeah.
Rick, can I ask you
oh, yeah.
sorry. Can I ask you an almost trivial question? In Paris, did you typically just go to places and enter, or did you attempt to book times or even go with a guide?
No, we just went to places and entered, and it was in some situations probably a mistake, like especially Sainte-Chapelle. We should have pre-booked for that.
Yeah.
But even the people who had pre-booked were still waiting in line to get in.
Notre Dame, for example, they offer reservations. They're free. You can only make them 3 days in advance, and they emphasize that you don't need them. Would it be your estimation that they're probably a good idea?
Notre Dame, it didn't really matter that much. There was a line, but it was really moving quickly. So that wasn't an issue. But Sainte-Chapelle, definitely, we were queuing up for probably 2 hours to get in.
How about the sewers? Was there a lineup to get in?
To get out.
Straight in, and we were the only English speakers, so we got the English speaking guidebook. Yeah, there weren't many people in there, but it was a really interesting museum. I really enjoyed it.
Cool too. Cool, I imagine.
Yes, it was cool, and it wasn't as smelly as you might expect. It was just a slight whiff here and there.
Canal number 5.
No, that wasn't any lineup whatsoever.
So I was in Paris just after you in October,
Mhm.
and we organized a private guide. There were 6 of us, and got into Notre Dame early in the morning, and there was almost nobody there. It was just wonderful to be able to do. What was interesting is that if you were more than 5 people, all of the tour spots were totally booked up to go into Notre Dame. The guide could go in, but she could only carry 5 people in with her
Uh-huh.
and guide. But actually, all 6 of us went with her, and nobody bothered us. So that was good. And we also pre-booked, as you said, to go to the Chapelle and the Conciergerie with the same guide.
Mhm.
And again, if you can book well in advance and get a guide, they have a special line that they go in with no waiting at all.
Yeah.
Again, the tickets for that time that we wanted to go were totally sold out for the day we were there. So
Mhm.
we booked for the time slot, and she just met us inside. We had to wait about 30 minutes or 25 minutes to get in, even though we had pre-booked.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, another time I would have done it differently, but that's what we did at the time.
Yeah.
But the other things that were more organized, I mean, like Versailles and Giverny, and the Eiffel Tower, that was all organized and booked with a guide.
Right.
And yes, you get that easy entrance, but I would not recommend Versailles, at least not at the time we went. Apparently, people who've been at other times said it wasn't anywhere near as crowded, but in June it was absolutely awful. Although the gardens were lovely, I'll give you that. I'm just not fond of crowds, so it didn't suit me.
Well, again, Rick, thanks very much for a wonderful beginning
Pleasure.
to this year. I want to just mention to everyone that we already have plans, talks scheduled all the way into July. And the next 2 talks will be given by people who've talked before, one by Nancy Langton, and she's going to talk about Iceland on February 12th. And I'm going to talk on March the 19th about a trip to Prague and then along the Danube to Budapest. And then we have 3 brand new speakers who've never talked before for April, May, and June. And then Andy Eisen, who's talked once before, is going to talk to us in July. So we're all set until the summer comes. So I hope that you will come and join us and hear about some of these interesting places that different people have visited. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you next on February the 12th it is.
And thank you,
Okay.
Paul, for taking the trouble.
You're very
organize
welcome.
this.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. Great.
Yeah.
Great talk, great pictures.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.